This morning, December 8, 2024, we woke up to a world where the Assad regime no longer rules Syria. Bashar al-Assad, the dictator responsible for torturing over 100,000 people to death and killing hundreds of thousands during the civil war, is no longer in power and may even be dead. This shift happened incredibly quickly. The entire offensive lasted just over a week after more than a decade of civil war. In this video, I want to give you a brief overview of the current situation in Syria without the Assad regime, summarize yesterday's events, and discuss what might happen next, as the fighting isn't over yet, and the civil war is entering a new phase. Let's start with yesterday. A lot happened, and the best way to illustrate it is by comparing Syria's geopolitical map from the same time yesterday to today. The red areas, as you might know, represent Assad regime-controlled territories, while the green areas are controlled by opposition groups. Damascus has fallen and is now under opposition control, along with Homs. Essentially, the Assad regime collapsed remarkably quickly. Yesterday morning, the key question was whether Homs, Syria's third-largest city and a critical transportation hub, would fall. Following the capture of Hama, the fourth-largest city a few days earlier, all eyes turned to Homs. The battle unfolded much like what we saw in Aleppo, with opposition forces advancing rapidly amid reports of low morale among Assad's troops. Surprisingly, there was less resistance than expected for a city of 700,000 to 800,000 people. Meanwhile, significant events were also taking place in southern Syria, between Damascus and the Jordanian border. This region, particularly around the city of Daraa, has historical significance as the birthplace of the 2011 revolution. Known as the cradle of the revolution, Daraa was a key site of early anti-Assad protests. Rebel groups in the south, including remnants of the old Free Syrian Army (FSA), have re-emerged. Not all rebels are Islamist militants or terrorists. Many groups in the south, including Druze militias, have joined the fight against Assad. The Druze, a religious minority with no ties to Islamism, have also played a role, even raising their flag during the removal of Assad statues. The swift decline of Assad's regime was likely due to the loss of foreign support from allies like Hezbollah, Russia, and Iran. This collapse underscores how little loyalty remained among his forces. Agreements made in recent years, which sought to demilitarize southern rebel groups, have largely fallen apart, leading to a resurgence of armed resistance. In the past days, the rebels made significant gains in the south, liberating Daraa and many nearby towns. The situation evolved rapidly, with updates showing towns breaking away from the regime every few minutes. Damascus was encircled by rebels, with pockets of opposition forming even near the Lebanese border. Despite defiant statements from regime officials claiming their defenses would hold, the capital ultimately fell. Meanwhile, near the Israeli border and the Golan Heights, minor skirmishes occurred. There were reports of attacks on a UN outpost, prompting an Israeli military response. Israel has warned all Syrian rebel groups to stay away from the Golan Heights or face retaliation. The incidents involving Israel appear to have been small-scale and unrelated to the larger conflict. As of this morning, opposition forces are in control of Damascus and advancing rapidly. Despite some regime officials attempting to downplay the situation, the collapse of Assad's rule is undeniable. The civil war has entered a new phase, and it remains to be seen what comes next in a Syria without Assad. This captures the core information while condensing and clarifying the original text. As the situation continues to unfold, the rapid collapse of the Assad regime highlights several critical developments. Yesterday's events in particular demonstrated how coordinated efforts from various opposition groups, some long-standing, others newly re-emerged, have managed to dismantle a regime that seemed entrenched for decades. This collapse wasn't just limited to major cities like Damascus and Homs. Across Syria, smaller towns and villages have either risen up or declared their independence from Assad's rule. Statues of Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father and predecessor, were toppled in symbolic gestures of defiance, signaling the rejection of decades of authoritarian rule. The role of regional powers in this transformation cannot be understated. The withdrawal of foreign support, especially from Iran, Hezbollah and Russia, left Assad isolated and vulnerable. Over the years, These allies had propped up his regime through military aid, manpower and funding, but their recent disengagement marked a turning point. This withdrawal not only weakened the Assad regime militarily, but also had a psychological impact on his forces, contributing to the swift and widespread desertion of soldiers who no longer saw a reason to fight. The opposition, on the other hand, has grown increasingly complex. While groups like the Free Syrian Army (FSA) once dominated the anti-Assad movement, today's rebel landscape is more fragmented. Islamist factions, including groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham (HTS), continue to play a prominent role in northern Syria. However, in the south, a diverse coalition of opposition groups, including secular factions and minority militias like the Druze, has emerged. This diversity highlights the multifaceted nature of the uprising and challenges simplistic narratives that paint all rebels as Islamists or extremists. In the south, the resurgence of groups like the Southern Front, now often referred to as the Southern Military Command, has reignited hope for some Syrians. These groups, which include remnants of the original FSA, have reclaimed territory and demonstrated an ability to coordinate effectively. Their efforts, combined with spontaneous uprisings from local populations, created a domino effect that rapidly weakened regime control in the region. Dara'a's liberation in particular was both strategically and symbolically significant, as it marked a return to the city where the revolution began in 2011. Despite these gains, the situation remains precarious. The fall of Damascus does not signify an immediate end to the conflict. Rebel groups, many with competing ideologies and agendas, now face the challenge of managing liberated territories and preventing infighting. Furthermore, remnants of Assad's forces could regroup and attempt to retake lost ground, especially in areas where rebel control is less consolidated. There are also significant concerns about external interventions. Israel's warnings to rebel groups near the Golan Heights highlight the potential for broader regional complications. The Israeli military's limited involvement thus far suggests a desire to protect its borders rather than actively influence the outcome in Syria. However, further provocations or missteps could escalate tensions, particularly if groups with ties to Islamist factions operate near Israeli territory. Looking ahead, the most immediate challenge for Syria's opposition will be establishing a semblance of governance in areas no longer under regime control. This includes ensuring basic security, providing services to war-weary civilians, and addressing divisions within the anti-Assad movement. Without a unified vision or leadership, the risk of further fragmentation and internal conflict looms large. At the same time, the international community faces a critical moment. Decisive action will be required to support reconstruction, facilitate peace talks, and prevent Syria from descending into further chaos. Whether global powers seize this opportunity to stabilize the region or allow it to become another failed state remains to be seen. As the civil war enters this uncertain phase, one thing is clear: Syria will never be the same. The collapse of the Assad regime marks the end of an era, but what comes next will shape the country's future for generations to come. Essentially, this situation mirrors what we saw in 2003 with the Iraqi information minister during the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. For those who remember, similar images and reports are emerging now. The rebels have advanced further, taking more towns and even suburbs of Damascus. Pictures and videos show statues and posters of Assad being torn down. There are increasing instances of Syrian soldiers publicly removing their uniforms and deserting, a typical sign of a regime's collapse, as people no longer want to fight and die for a lost cause. As the rebel advance continued, questions arose about Bashar al-Assad's whereabouts. Rumors circulated, with some saying he had fled to one place or another, though nothing was concrete. In a desperate last-minute attempt, Assad reportedly sought a diplomatic solution by sending an envoy to Viktor Orbán, asking him to plead his case to Donald Trump, who wasn't even president yet and wouldn't be for over a month. Assad supposedly offered to distance himself from Iran and Hezbollah in exchange for safe passage or a secure zone, but this attempt was futile. By nightfall, reports confirmed that Damascus had fallen to the rebels, following the earlier capture of Homs. It became clear that the regime was collapsing. Meanwhile, reports surfaced that Russian forces were withdrawing from their bases in Syria. The Russian fleet evacuated the Tartus naval base, and large transport planes arrived at their airbase, suggesting an evacuation was underway. This marked a significant failure for Russia, as it abandoned Assad, its longtime ally, losing its foothold in the region. The potential loss of its only Mediterranean naval base is a severe blow to Vladimir Putin's reputation and Russia's influence. Unexpectedly, there were also reports of anti-Assad demonstrations in Tartus, a region traditionally loyal to the regime and home to the Alawite sect. However, with Assad's regime no longer in power, even this stronghold seems to be turning. Speculation arose about the possible establishment of an Alawite state in the region, though that remains uncertain. The focus then shifted to Assad himself. Rumors intensified that, as rebels seized the capital, Assad boarded a plane heading toward Lebanon. However, the plane reportedly made a sudden U-turn, lost altitude, and disappeared from radar. There is growing speculation that Assad may have been killed during an attempt to flee, possibly by a missile strike. Various theories emerged, including that the plane was shot down by Turkish-backed forces, Russian air defenses, or even the Israeli Air Force. However, nothing has been confirmed, and it remains unclear if Assad was even on board. In Damascus, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS, the most powerful rebel group, called for restraint and urged rebels not to loot government buildings, portraying HTS as a force for stability. This fits HTS's recent attempts to distance itself from its jihadist image, presenting itself as a unifying force for Syrians. While their sincerity is questionable, the group has made deals with minorities such as Christians and Druze in Aleppo and other areas, portraying itself as inclusive. Despite Assad's fall, the civil war is far from over. Turkish-backed factions, particularly the Syrian National Army, SNA, have shifted focus to fighting the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, in the northeast. The SNA, which operates as a Turkish proxy, is targeting areas under Kurdish control, including Manbij, with heavy fighting reported. Unlike HTS, which prioritized fighting the Assad regime, the SNA follows Ankara's directives, making the Kurdish-controlled regions the new battlefield. The fall of the Assad regime marks a turning point, but Syria's future remains uncertain. The rebels have taken Damascus, and the fight continues elsewhere, with new alliances and conflicts shaping the post-Assad era. The developments in Syria are reshaping the dynamics of the region, with multiple factions vying for control and influence. The fall of the Assad regime, while symbolically significant, has left a power vacuum that various groups and external players are eager to fill. The rebel factions, particularly Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, are attempting to consolidate their hold over territories while projecting an image of governance and stability. However, their Islamist roots and history make their long-term intentions a topic of debate. Meanwhile, the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, SNA, has shifted its focus to Kurdish-controlled areas, reflecting Turkey's broader geopolitical goals in the region. Turkey views the Kurdish forces, particularly the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, as a threat due to their links with the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Ankara considers a terrorist organization. This has led to intense clashes in areas like Manbij and potential conflict over strategic locations such as Deir ez-Zor. The SDF, which has played a crucial role in the fight against ISIS, now faces a new front, defending its territories against Turkish proxies. The Kurdish question is likely to become a central issue in the post-Assad landscape. The SDF, a coalition of Kurds, Arabs, Christians, and other minority groups, has established a semi-autonomous administration in northeastern Syria. However, their position is precarious, as they are caught between Turkish aggression, rebel factions, and the remnants of Assad's forces. International support, particularly from the US, has been vital for the SDF, but it remains uncertain how long this backing will continue, especially as global attention shifts away from Syria. Russia's retreat from Syria marks another critical shift. Having invested heavily in propping up Assad's regime, Moscow's decision to abandon its ally signals a recognition of the regime's inevitable collapse. This retreat not only weakens Russia's position in the Middle East, but also raises questions about its ability to project power beyond its borders. Losing strategic military bases like Tartus and Memim would be a severe blow to Russia's influence in the region and its ambitions as a global power. Additionally, the perception of Russia's unreliability as an ally may further isolate it on the international stage. For Iran and Hezbollah, Assad's fall is equally devastating. Both have invested significant resources and manpower in supporting the regime, viewing Syria as a critical link in their regional axis of influence. With Assad gone, Iran's presence in Syria is likely to face greater challenges, both from the rebels and potentially from Israel, which has consistently targeted Iranian assets in the country. Hezbollah, already stretched thin from its involvement in the Syrian war, could face growing pressure in Lebanon as it struggles to justify its costly intervention. The broader implications of Assad's downfall extend beyond Syria. Regionally, it signals the end of an era in which autocratic regimes could rely on foreign backing to suppress uprisings. The Arab Spring may have been declared over, but the fall of Assad could inspire renewed movements against authoritarianism in other countries. Internationally, it underscores the limitations of external powers in determining the outcomes of civil wars, as both Russia and Iran have discovered. Looking ahead, the situation remains fluid. The rebels, particularly HTS, must navigate the challenge of transitioning from a militant force to a governing body, while managing relationships with minorities and other factions. The SNA, under Turkey's direction, will continue its campaign against Kurdish forces, potentially destabilizing the northeast further. The Kurds, for their part, will need to strengthen alliances and seek international guarantees to protect their gains. And while Assad's regime may be gone, the scars of his rule and the war will linger for years to come. Ultimately, the question of Syria's future, whether as a unified state, a collection of autonomous regions, or a fragmented territory controlled by various factions, remains unresolved. The only certainty is that the road ahead will be fraught with challenges, and the Syrian people who have borne the brunt of this conflict will continue to seek stability and peace in a land scarred by over a decade of war.